Escape from Afghanistan, Chapter 9. One day we got a letter, hand-carried to us by some traveler. Alas, it was not from my brothers. It came from my mother's cousin in Quetta, a city on the Pakistani side of the Afghan border. We'd lost track of her and did not even know she was there. But somehow, 6 months after my father's death, she had heard about the events and about our quandary. "Come to Quetta," she wrote. "Get across the border somehow, and then come directly to Quetta. Do not tarry in Peshawar. That is a Taliban stronghold, a Pashtun city. You won't be welcome there. In fact, you will be in danger, for the Taliban come from that region, and they are prejudiced against the Hazaras. Peshawar is a dangerous place for two Hazara women on their own. Do not go into the city if you can avoid it. Just come to Quetta." And she gave directions for finding her house once we got to her city. This cousin of my mother's had moved to Quetta some time ago. She had a settled life there. She had lost her husband, but she had a brother and 2 sons living in Turkmenistan. Those men had gotten out of Afghanistan during the communist era. They had gone to Turkmenistan to study, and then, because the country had dissolved into civil war, they had simply stayed. They now worked in the former Soviet Republic and sent bits of money from time to time. That's what my mother's cousin lived on. Well, we talked it over with our neighbors and decided that we had to do it. We made the inquiries and learned that we could pay a man to serve as our escort on the bus to Jalalabad. That would get us out of Taliban-dominated Kabul. From Jalalabad to the border, we would be on our own. As for getting across the border, no one knew what that entailed. And as for making the journey from the border to Quetta, that was like asking how to get from one part of the moon to another part. No one could give us any advice on that subject. We would just have to figure things out when we got there. By the time we left Afghanistan, the warm days had come. We wrapped the few possessions we would take along in little cloth bundles. We could not take much, for we would have to carry whatever we took. And while I could not handle much of a load, my poor mother was in even worse shape. The day my father died, her asthma took a turn for the worst. Now she was rasping with every breath, and exertion of any kind tightened up the air passages. We had no medicine for her condition. When it got bad, all she could do was rest. So the last thing we needed was extra baggage. We made it to Jalalabad by bus. We could not have gotten there any other way. The stretch of road between Kabul and Jalalabad goes over some of the country's steepest mountains, cutting through 2 rugged gorges. The Kabul cataracts and the highway had been cut into nearly solid rock, folding back and forth, like a ribbon along the riverbank. Once the road descended out of those gorges, the weather changed. The temperature rose. Now we were in the Jalalabad Valley, which was dotted with groves of orange trees and lemon trees. The bus let us off in a crowded bazaar. We were frightened to be there alone and frightened to have to ask for advice and directions, but we addressed our questions to women as much as possible, or to family groups that included women. In this way, we found out how to get to the other bus station. This other bus station wasn't really a station. There was no building, no ticket booth, and no station agent. Nothing like that. The so-called bus station looked like any other part of the bazaar. It was just a road lined on both sides with merchant stalls. Along this strip of bazaar, however, men cruised back and forth in vans they owned, looking for people who wanted to go to the border. If you just stood at the curb, they pulled over and offered you a ride. Before we got on, though, other people waiting there for rides advised us to get some plastic bags. We didn't know why, but we figured we had better do whatever other travelers were doing. They no doubt knew more than we did. Curiously enough, some of the stalls in that vicinity sold plastic bags as if they were a normal travel need. Shortly after we took up our post on the side of the road, a van pulled over. Instantly, a crowd surged towards its doors. People fought and threw elbows to get to the front so they could board. That's how it was at the bus station. Only the most aggressive travelers got rides. Each van could carry 10 or 12 people if they squeezed, and they always squeezed. The drivers wanted to make as much money as they could. We were unable to get onto the first van. We could not get on to the next one either. By the third one, however, I saw what we needed to do, and taking my mother by the arm, I shoved and pushed with the others until we made it to the door of the van. It wasn't all that far from Jalalabad to the border, but we were traveling in the heat of mid-afternoon. Dust boiled around the car and got in through the windows. My mother began to wheeze and gasp. I worried that she might stop breathing right then and there, so I tried to shield her with my body, tried to keep the other passengers from pressing in on her so that she would have her own space to breathe out of. Meanwhile, the dust mingled with the sweat running down my face, turning to mud by the time it reached my chin. At that moment, I discovered what the plastic bags were for. One of the men in the back seat vomited loudly, barely getting his awful stew into the bag. The nasty odor immediately pervaded the entire van. My nostrils puckered, and I felt my own vomit rising. I grabbed for my bag. Within minutes, all of us passengers were filling up our plastic bags. No, it wasn't far from Jalalabad to the border, just a couple of hours, but that ride felt like it would never end. About half a mile from the border, the band pulled over to the side of the road. "This is as far as we go," the driver said. "That's the border up ahead. You see those two buildings and the gate between them? That's it. If you can get through that gate, you're in Pakistan. About half a mile up the road on the other side, if you can get to the other side, you'll find other cars like this one offering rides to Peshawar." Well, we got out and started trudging toward the border station. We were not alone. The whole stretch of road was filled with people hoping to get across the border that day. Hundreds of families. I don't know how many. I wasn't counting. I didn't count. I was distracted by the scene I saw up ahead. The gate to Pakistan was closed, and I could see that the Pakistani border guards were letting no one through. People were pushing and shoving and jostling up against the gate, and the guards were driving them back. As we got closer, the crowd thickened, and I could hear the roar and clamor at the gate. The Afghans were yelling something, and the Pakistanis were yelling back. My mother was clutching her side and gasping for breath, trying to keep up. I felt desperate to get through because the sun was setting, and if we got stuck here, what were we going to do? Where would we stay? There was nothing here. No town, no hotel, no buildings, just the desert. Yes, we had no real chance of getting through. Big, strong men were running up to the gate in vain. The guards had clubs and they had carbines too, which they turned around and used as weapons. Again and again the crowd surged toward the gate and the guards drove them back with their sticks and clubs, swinging and beating until the crowd receded. And after that, for the next few minutes, on our side of the border, people milled about and muttered and stoked their own impatience, worked up their rage until gradually the crowd gathered strength and surged against the gate again, only to be swept back. We never even got close to the front. We got caught up in the thinning rear end of the crowd, and even so we were part of each wave, pulled forward driving back. It was hard for me to keep my footing, and my mother was clutching my arm now, just hanging on, just trying to stay close to me, because the worst thing would have been if we had gotten separated. Finally, I saw that it was no use. We were only risking injury. We drifted back out of the crowd. In the thickening dusk, we could hear the dull roar of people still trying to get past the border guards, but we receded into the desert, farther and farther back from the border. Night was falling, and we were stranded out there in the open. But at least it wasn't cold. That was a blessing. And at least we were not alone. For that, too, I felt grateful. Hundreds of us were hunkering down there on the desert floor in the shadows of the high hills that marked the border. We were clotted into family groups. Some groups managed to get fires going, which added a feeling of cheer. They chatted quietly about their fires, and we could hear their voices. There was something companionable about it, really. We were all just ordinary folks caught up in a bad situation, sharing the same fate. No one there meant anybody harm. Had I been alone, I would have felt frightened. But with that sea of families surrounding me, I felt safe, even if they were strangers. My mother and I had our little cloth bundles in which we were each carrying some extra clothes, and we had our headscarves. We put those under our heads as pillows and slept under the stars. It wasn't bad. We did manage to catch some sleep. Then dawn came, and we again had to make our way to the road and try to get across the border. What else could we do? We could not go back, nor could we stay in the wasteland indefinitely. We had to get through. But once again the guards were keeping the gate closed, beating and hitting anyone who got close enough each time the crowd rushed. On that second day, however, I learned that it was all a question of money. Someone told me about this, and then I watched closely and saw that it was true. Throughout the day, while some of the guards confronted the crowds, a few others lounged over to the side. People approached them quietly. Money changed hands, and the guards then let those people quietly through a small door on the side. Hundreds could have flown through that main gate, and it had been opened. But only one or two could get through the side door at a time. The fact that the guards were taking bribes did us no good whatsoever. We did not have the money to pay them. What little we had we would need to get from Peshawar to Quetta. And so the second day passed. At the end of the day, we found ourselves camping near a friendly family. We struck up a conversation with them. The woman told us that her husband, Ghulam Ali, had gone to look for another way across the border. He was checking out a goat path that supposedly went over the mountains several miles northeast of the border station. If one could get to Pakistan safely by that route, he would come back for his family. "You can go with us," the woman said. Later that night, her husband showed up. "It works," he said. "Smugglers use that path, and they bribe the guards to leave it unguarded. Of course, we don't want to run into any smugglers either, but if we go late at night, we should be fine." His wife then told him our story, and Ghulam Ali took pity on us. "Yes, of course you can come with us," he said. "But you have had 2 hard days. You will need some rest before you attempt this mountain crossing. Spend tonight here and sleep well, knowing that you will have nothing to do tomorrow except lounge around, rest, and catch your breath. Tomorrow, do not throw yourself against those border guards again. Let your only work be the gathering of your strength. Then tomorrow night we will go all over the mountains together. With God's grace, I will show you the way. If God wills it, we will follow the smuggler's path to safety. You and your mother are in my care now." So we spent the whole next day there. It was terribly warm, and we had no water. But we walked a little way and found a mosque that refugees like us had built over the years, so that people waiting to get across the border would have a place to say their prayers. We got some water to drink at the mosque, and we had namaz there too. Somehow we obtained a bit of bread as well. I can't remember how that turned out, but there it was, and we ate it. We sustained our strength. After sunset, we lay down just as if we were going to spend another night. In fact, I did fall asleep for a while, long after dark, or early the next morning, to be exact. Before the sun came up, that man shook us awake. "It's time," he said. We got up and performed our ablutions quickly and in the darkness, with just sand, because that's allowed when you have no access to water. We said our prayers. The Ghulam Ali began to march into the darkness with his family, and we trudged along silently behind them. After several miles, the path began to climb, and my mother began to wheeze. Her asthma was pretty bad at this time, poor thing. No doubt her anxiety made it worse. But in such circumstances, how could she rid herself of anxiety? It was no use knowing that our difficulty was rooted in anxiety, just as it was no use knowing that we could have moved more quickly if we had possessed wings. Life is what it is. The path over the mountain was not actually very long, only a couple of miles. Steep as it was, we could have gotten over a little more than an hour if not for my mother. Because of her, we had to pause every few minutes, so our journey took many hours. I myself hardly felt the exertion. I was walking quite well that day, quite athletically. I had the good prosthetic leg from Germany. The foot was a little worn by then, but not enough to slow me down. Thinking back, I'm puzzled actually. How did I scale that mountain so easily? How did I climb down the other side? These days I find it hard to clamber up 2 or 3 flights of stairs even. I don't know what made me so subtle and strong that day, but I felt no hardship, no anxiety or fear, just concentration and intensity. Perhaps my mother's problems distracted me from my own. That might account for it. Perhaps desperation gave me energy and made me forget the rigor of the climb. Well, whatever the reason, I scrambled up like a goat. The family we were following had a girl only a bit younger than me. She was moving slowly. Her family used my example to chide her. They kept saying, "Look at that girl. She's missing a leg, and yet she's going faster than you. Why can't you keep up? Hurry now." That Ghulam Ali was certainly a good man, so patient with us and so compassionate. He never'd seen us before, and yet when he met us, he said, "I will help you." That's the thing about life. You never know when and where you will encounter a spot of human decency. I have felt alone in this world at times. I've known long periods of being no one. But then, without warning, a person like Ghulam Ali just turns up and says, "I see you. I'm on your side." Strangers have been kind to me when it mattered most. That sustains a person's hope and faith. Anyway, climbing up that mountain on the Afghanistan side took some effort. But after we topped the crest, even my mother found the going down part fairly easy. We hardly stopped at all on the downward side. Going up took hours, coming down took minutes, or so it seemed. As soon as we reached the bottom of the slope, Ghulam Ali told us we were now officially in Pakistan. We peered around. The landscape looked just the same here as it did back where we came from. And yet we were in Pakistan. We had escaped from Afghanistan. We started laughing. We couldn't stop. We tried to stop our mouths with our palms, but we could not do it. The laughter just insisted on bursting forth from us. Happiness filled our hearts. My mother's asthma disappeared without a trace for 1 whole hour. Yes, for 1 whole hour there, my mother could breathe. You might as well say we had been in prison for 30 years and had suddenly been released. That was the kind of joy we felt.